The small wooden cabin sat nestled at the edge of Pine Creek Valley, just where the forest began to thicken, and the settled land gave way to wilderness. Smoke curled from its chimney most mornings, a thin gray line against the vast sky that seemed to whisper, "Someone still lives here." That someone was Annie, a girl of 15 winters who folks in the nearby settlement had taken to calling the little Orphan whenever they spoke of her. 6 months had passed since the fever took both her ma and pa within days of each other. Winter had been cruel that year, burying the valley in snow deeper than anyone could remember. By the time the doctor from town could make it through the drifts, it was too late for either of them. Annie had watched, hollow-eyed, as neighbors helped dig graves in the frozen earth behind the cabin. The ground was so hard they couldn't dig deep enough, and come spring, she'd had to pile more dirt on top when the thaw revealed what winter had tried to hide. Now it was autumn again, and Annie faced another winter alone. "You're welcome to a room with us, child," Mrs. Cooper from the general store had offered just yesterday when Annie brought in a basket of vegetables to trade. A young girl shouldn't be out there all alone with winter coming on. Annie had just smiled politely and shook her head. "Thank you kindly, but I'm managing fine." The truth was she couldn't bear to leave the cabin. Every wooden board, every handmade quilt, every chipped cup in the cupboard held pieces of her parents. In the garden, her ma's rosemary still grew where she'd planted it. Pa's axe still leaned in the exact spot by the door where he'd last placed it. Sometimes when the wind blew just right through the cabin's small windows, Annie could almost hear her ma humming while she worked, or her pa's deep laugh when he told one of his stories by the fire. The morning light filtered through the trees as Annie gathered eggs from the chicken coop. Only 4 hens remained from the dozen they once had. Foxes had taken some, and she'd had to eat others during the hardest parts of winter when the stored food ran low. She counted the eggs carefully, 3 today. She'd boil 1 for breakfast, save 1 for tomorrow, and the 3rd would go into the cornbread she planned to make. Inside the cabin, she stoked the embers in the fireplace and added kindling, blowing gently until the flames caught. Her pa had taught her how to build a fire when she was just 7. "A good fire is like a good friend," he'd said. "It needs attention and respect, but gives warmth in return." She thought of those words every morning as she coaxed the day's first fire to life. Annie's days followed a pattern she had built carefully for herself. After breakfast, she tended to her small garden, pulling weeds from around the turnips, carrots, and potatoes. The pumpkins were ripening nicely, 3 good-sized ones that would see her through part of winter. Next came carrying water from the creek that ran about 50 paces behind the cabin. She made the trip 4 times each day, the wooden bucket growing heavier with each journey as the season progressed and her strength slowly diminished from less food. In the afternoon, she would mend clothes, chop firewood, or hunt for berries and nuts in the forest. Her pa had taught her to set rabbit snares, and on good days she'd find one waiting for her. On bad days, it was just corn mush again. Sometimes in the quiet of midday, loneliness would settle around her shoulders like a heavy shawl. On those days, she would take out her ma's Bible and trace the letters with her finger, sounding out the words she recognized. Her ma had been teaching her to read before she passed, and Annie kept practicing, determined not to lose what little she had learned. "You keep learning those letters, Annie girl," her ma had said during those lessons at the kitchen table. "Words are doorways to places you might never see otherwise." The folks from the settlement checked on her occasionally, bringing small offerings of food or supplies. Reverend Thomas had stopped by twice to make sure she was right with the Lord, and to remind her that the community stands ready to embrace you, child. The Wilkins family had offered to take her in, as had the Coopers and the blacksmith's family. Each time Annie thanked them politely but firmly refused. What none of them understood was that out here, in this cabin, she wasn't just the poor orphan girl. Here, she was still her parents' daughter, the keeper of their home, the tender of their garden, the one who remembered the way her ma liked to arrange wildflowers in a jar on the table, or how her pa would whistle the same tune every morning while he split wood. In town, she'd be a charity case, an extra mouth to feed, someone to be pitied. Annie couldn't stand the thought of those sad smiles and whispered comments that stopped when she entered a room. "Poor thing," they'd say, not knowing she could hear them perfectly well. Such a tragedy. Late one Tuesday, old Mr. Hobson rode out to deliver a letter that had come on the monthly mail coach. It was from her aunt in Cincinnati, a woman she'd never met who wrote stiff, formal sentences offering to take Annie in, as Christian duty demands. You should consider it, Mr. Hobson said, shifting uncomfortably on his horse. Winter's coming harder than last year, they say. Might not be folks able to get out here to check on you for weeks at a time. Annie just nodded and tucked the letter into her apron pocket. She never wrote back. As October deepened, she worked harder each day to prepare. She dried apple slices on strings hung near the fireplace. She stored potatoes in the root cellar her pa had dug beneath the cabin floor. She smoked the meat from 2 rabbits and a squirrel she'd managed to shoot with her pa's old rifle, a weapon almost as tall as she was, and with a kick that left her shoulder bruised for days. Each night, as darkness settled over the valley and the creatures of the forest began their evening conversations, Annie would light a single candle to save the others. She'd wrap herself in her parents' quilt and whisper the day's events to the empty chairs as if her ma and pa still sat there, listening. Got most of the north garden harvested today, she might say. Those turnip seeds you traded for last spring came up real nice. Pa. Or, found some of that mint you liked by the creek. Ma, made tea with it tonight. Sometimes she imagined their replies. Her pa's practical advice about banking the cabin against the wind. Her ma's gentle reminders to mend the tear in her winter coat before the cold set in properly. In these moments, the silence of the cabin seemed less empty, more like a pause in conversation than an endless void. It was a comfort she couldn't explain to the well-meaning townsfolk who saw only danger and hardship. In her solitary life, what frightened her most weren't the howls of wolves in the distance or the prospect of sickness with no one to fetch help. What frightened her was forgetting. The exact sound of her ma's voice when she sang lullabies, the way her pa's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the feel of her ma's hand smoothing her hair after a bad dream. Each day she struggled to keep these memories clear and present, terrified that they might slip away like morning mist if she left this place where they had lived and loved. One evening, as she sat by the fire darning a sock for the 3rd time in the same spot, a fierce autumn storm blew in from the west. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the shutters her pa had made. Rain pounded on the roof, finding the spots that needed patching and sending thin streams of water into the buckets Annie hurriedly placed around the cabin. As the storm raged, a branch from the old oak beside the cabin gave way with a crack like thunder, crashing onto the roof above the small bedroom. Annie stood frozen in the middle of the main room, listening to the groaning of the roof beams. Then water began to pour through in earnest. That night she dragged her bedding to the main room and slept fitfully by the fire, waking at every creak and groan of the cabin. For the first time since her parents' passing, she wondered if she had made the right choice in staying. Come morning, she would need to climb onto the roof to assess the damage, to see if she could make repairs before the next rainfall. As dawn broke and the storm moved eastward, Annie stepped outside to survey the damage in the gray morning light. The large branch had punched a hole in the roof big enough to put her arm through. Looking up at it, she felt a wave of despair wash over her. Her pa would have known exactly how to fix it. He would have been up on that roof before the rain had even stopped, patching and securing. She was still standing there, neck craned back, when she heard the splashing of the creek behind her cabin grow louder, more insistent. The storm had swollen it to twice its normal size, turning the usually gentle flow into a rushing torrent. Annie watched the water churning brown and angry, carrying branches and debris from upstream. It was then that she first noticed movement on the far bank. A figure struggling against the current, attempting to cross at the narrowest point. Squinting against the morning light, Annie could make out the shape of a girl about her own age. The girl's left leg dragged noticeably as she tested the water's edge, and her face was tight with pain or determination, perhaps both. Annie watched, her own troubles momentarily forgotten, as the girl stepped carefully into the rushing creek. The water immediately pushed against her, nearly knocking her off balance. The girl steadied herself on a partially submerged rock, but Annie could see it was a losing battle. The creek was simply too swollen, too powerful, especially for someone already struggling to walk. Without conscious thought, Annie found herself moving. Annie didn't stop to think about what the folks in the settlement might say. She simply acted. Grabbing a long, sturdy branch that had fallen during the storm, she hurried down to the creek bank, waving to get the girl's attention. "Wait," she called out. "The water's too high." The native girl paused, 1 foot already in the rushing water. She stared at Annie with a mixture of caution and pain in her eyes. Up close, Annie could see that her ankle was wrapped in some kind of plant leaves, and her face was drawn tight with discomfort. Annie pointed to a spot about 20 yards downstream. "There," she called, gesturing with her hands to make her meaning clear. "Narrower there." The girl seemed to understand and began making her way carefully along the bank. Annie did the same on her side, clutching the branch. The creek narrowed at a bend where a fallen tree created a partial bridge. The water still rushed dangerously beneath it, but it was better than attempting to wade through the deepest part. When they both reached the spot, Annie extended the branch across the narrowest section. She pantomimed how the girl could hold on to it while crossing. The girl hesitated, studying Annie's face as if searching for something. Whatever she was looking for, she must have found it, because after a moment, she nodded and reached for the branch. "Careful," Annie said, though she knew the girl probably couldn't understand her words. "Step where the rocks stick up." The crossing was tense. Twice the girl nearly lost her footing on the slippery stones, and Annie had to brace herself hard against the pull of both the current and the girl's weight. When the girl's bad leg slipped into a deeper part of the creek, she let out a small cry that needed no translation. Annie leaned forward, risking her own balance to offer a steadier grip. "Almost there," Annie encouraged, their hands now clasped tightly. "Just a few more steps." With a final effort, the girl made it to Annie's side of the creek. She stumbled onto the bank, breathing hard, her dark eyes meeting Annie's with a look of gratitude that transcended any language barrier. For a moment they just stood there, two girls from different worlds, connected by a simple act of help. The native girl said something in her own language, words Annie couldn't understand, but the tone of thanks was unmistakable. She pressed a hand to her chest and then extended it toward Annie in a gesture that seemed to mean gratitude. Annie smiled and mimicked the gesture. "I'm Annie," she said, pointing to herself. The girl watched her lips carefully, then pointed to herself. "Naya," she said clearly. "Naya," Annie repeated, and the girl nodded. It was only then that Annie noticed how badly Naya was shivering. Her clothes were soaked from the creek, and the autumn morning air was crisp. Without hesitation, Annie motioned toward her cabin. "Come on," she said, gesturing with her hand. "You need to get dry." Naya glanced nervously in the direction Annie was pointing, then back over her shoulder toward the forest on the far side of the creek. She seemed torn between following Annie and attempting to continue on her way. But when she tried to put weight on her injured ankle, she winced sharply. Annie pointed to the injured ankle and then toward the cabin again. "I can help," she said, miming wrapping something around her own ankle. After another moment of hesitation, Naya nodded and allowed Annie to support her as they made their way up the slight hill to the cabin. Annie couldn't help but notice how Naya's eyes darted everywhere, taking in the chicken coop, the garden with its wind-scattered plants, and the damaged roof with its gaping hole where the branch had fallen. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low. Annie guided Naya to sit on the small stool near the hearth and quickly added more kindling to build the flames back up. Naya watched every movement with alert eyes, her body tense as if ready to flee at any moment. When the fire blazed higher, sending warmth into the room, Annie saw some of that tension ease from the girl's shoulders. "Wait here," Annie said, making a staying motion with her hand. She fetched her only spare dress and a clean cloth for drying. When she held them out to Naya, the girl looked confused at first, but then understanding dawned in her eyes. She took the items with a small nod of thanks. Annie turned her back to give Naya privacy, busying herself with putting water on to boil. Behind her, she could hear the soft rustling of wet clothes being removed and dry ones being put on. When she finally turned around, Naya was dressed in Annie's faded blue cotton dress, her own wet clothes laid carefully by the fire to dry. The dress was a bit short on Naya, who was taller than Annie, but it would do. Now that they were in the light of the cabin, Annie could see Naya more clearly. She guessed they were about the same age, 15 or 16 winters. Naya's features were different from anyone in the settlement, her cheekbones higher, her eyes dark and alert, her skin a warm copper tone. Her black hair, now damp from the creek, was intricately braided with small wooden beads worked into the plaits. Naya sat back down on the stool and cautiously extended her injured ankle. The leaves she had wrapped around it had come loose during the creek crossing, revealing an angry red swelling. Annie knelt to examine it, gesturing to ask permission before touching. When Naya nodded, she gently felt around the swollen area. It didn't seem broken. Annie had seen her pa set a broken leg on a neighbor once, and this didn't have the same wrong angle to it. But it was badly sprained, the skin hot with inflammation. "Wait," Annie said, standing up. She went to a small shelf where her ma had kept healing supplies. From a clay jar, she took a handful of dried herbs, the arnica her ma had taught her to gather in summer. She crushed the dried flowers between her fingers, then mixed them with a bit of lard in a small bowl to make a salve. As she worked, she noticed Naya watching with interest. The girl pointed to the herbs and said something in her language. Then she reached into a small pouch that hung at her waist, which she had transferred from her wet clothes to the borrowed dress. From it, she pulled out some different dried leaves and held them up, making a similar grinding motion with her hands. Annie understood. Naya had been gathering her own healing plants when she got hurt. She smiled and nodded, then held out her salve for Naya to see. "For your ankle," she said, pointing. With careful hands, Annie applied the salve to the swollen ankle, then wrapped it with a clean strip of cloth. Naya winced but didn't pull away. When Annie finished, Naya touched the wrapping gently, then looked at Annie with approval in her eyes. The water on the fire had started to boil. Annie took it off the hook and made a simple tea with mint leaves, one of the few things that still grew wild near the cabin. She poured some into 2 cups and handed one to Naya. Naya sniffed the tea curiously before taking a small sip. A look of recognition crossed her face, and she said something that sounded like approval. She pointed to the mint leaves and said a word in her language. "Mint," Annie replied, saying the English word slowly. "Mint," Naya repeated carefully, the word sounding slightly different with her accent. Annie smiled. She pointed to herself again and repeated, "Annie." "Annie," Naya said, the name clear on her lips. They sat in companionable silence, sipping their tea. Outside, the day had brightened, the storm clouds giving way to patches of blue sky. Through the cabin window, Annie could see that the creek still ran high, but the worst of its fury had passed. When they finished their tea, Annie put together a simple meal of cornbread and the last of her dried rabbit meat. She hadn't planned to use the meat so soon, but something about having a guest, the first to sit at her table since her parents died, made her want to offer the best she had. They ate quietly, hunger making words unnecessary. Annie noticed how Naya handled the unfamiliar food with dignity, watching Annie first to see how she ate it. In return, Annie tried to show proper respect when Naya offered her a strange dark berry from her pouch. It was tart and sweet at the same time, unlike anything Annie had tasted before. After they had eaten, Naya stood carefully, testing her wrapped ankle. She could put a little weight on it now, though she still favored her good leg. She gathered her clothes, now mostly dry from the fireside, and began to change back into them behind the privacy of a blanket Annie held up. Once dressed in her own clothes again, Naya spoke earnestly to Annie in her language. Though Annie couldn't understand the words, the message seemed clear. Naya needed to return to her people. Annie nodded and pointed toward the door. "I'll help you part of the way," she said. Outside, the day had warmed considerably. The storm had cleared the air, making the autumn colors of the forest seem more vivid. Naya pointed to the woods beyond the creek, then made a walking motion with her fingers and held up 4 fingers. Annie guessed she meant her home was about 4 hours' walk away. With her injured ankle, that would be difficult. Annie fetched a sturdy walking stick that her pa had carved years ago and offered it to Naya. Naya took it with obvious gratitude. She tested it, leaning her weight against it, and nodded with satisfaction. Together they walked back to the creek, which had already receded enough that crossing at the fallen tree would be much easier now. Before they parted, Naya reached into her pouch once more. She pulled out a small item and pressed it into Annie's palm. It was a carved wooden pendant on a leather cord, a bird of some kind, its wings spread as if in flight. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each feather delicately carved into the smooth wood. 3 days passed before Annie saw Naya again. She had almost convinced herself that their meeting had been a one-time thing, a chance encounter that would remain nothing more than a strange, bright memory in her otherwise quiet life. But on the morning of the 4th day, as Annie was hanging laundry on the line behind her cabin, she spotted a figure standing at the edge of the woods across the creek. Naya. Annie's face broke into a smile. She waved, and even from this distance she could see Naya wave back. The native girl no longer limped badly, though she still carried a walking stick. Not Annie's father's stick, but one decorated with feathers and what looked like painted symbols. Annie dropped the wet shirt she was holding back into the basket and hurried down toward the creek. Naya crossed at the same fallen log as before, moving more confidently this time. When she reached Annie's side of the creek, she immediately made the now familiar gesture of hand over heart, then extended toward Annie. "You came back," Annie said, though she knew Naya wouldn't understand the words. Naya smiled and reached into a woven bag she carried. From it, she pulled out a small bundle wrapped in large leaves. She unwrapped it to reveal several plump fish, cleaned and ready for cooking. Then from another pocket in the bag, she produced a handful of unfamiliar roots and berries. Annie understood. It was a gift, a thank you for the help she had provided. "Thank you," she said, taking the offerings with genuine gratitude. Fresh fish would be a welcome change from her dwindling stores. She motioned for Naya to follow her back to the cabin. As they walked, Annie noticed that Naya seemed less cautious than before, her eyes taking in Annie's homestead with open curiosity, rather than wariness. At the cabin, Annie set about preparing the fish. She was surprised when Naya gently moved beside her and demonstrated a different way of cutting the fish, one that removed the small bones more efficiently than Annie's method. Working together, they soon had the fish ready for the fire. While the fish cooked, Naya pointed to Annie's damaged roof and made a questioning gesture. Annie sighed and tried to explain through gestures how the storm had brought down the branch. She mimicked her failed attempts to fix it, showing how the ladder her paw had made wasn't quite tall enough for her to reach properly. Naya studied the problem with narrowed eyes, then said something in her language and pointed eastward. She held up 3 fingers, then made a motion like the sun rising and setting. Annie guessed she was saying something or someone would come in 3 days. They ate the fish together along with a simple corn mush Annie had prepared. Naya showed her how to cook the strange roots she had brought, which had a sweet, earthy flavor unlike anything in Annie's garden. They spent the afternoon trying to share words in each other's languages. Annie would point to objects around the cabin saying their names in English, and Naya would respond with her own words. "Water," Annie would say, pointing to her bucket. "Pa," Naya would reply, the words soft on her tongue. By the time Naya left that evening, Annie had learned perhaps 24 words, and Naya seemed to have memorized a similar number of English terms. They parted with the same hand-over-heart gesture that was becoming their own special greeting and goodbye. True to her word, or at least what Annie had understood from her gestures, Naya returned 3 days later. This time she brought 2 young men from her tribe with her. The men regarded Annie with cautious respect, keeping their distance at first. Naya spoke rapidly to them, gesturing toward the roof and then to Annie. One of the men, who wore a necklace of bear claws and had hair that reached past his shoulders, nodded and said something to his companion. They had brought tools with them, stone axes, tough vines that served as rope, and what looked like needles made from bone. With impressive efficiency, they set about repairing Annie's roof, using techniques she had never seen before. They split shingles from a fallen pine with their stone tools and secured them over the hole with the vine rope, then sealed the gaps with a mixture of pine resin and mud that one of them prepared on the spot. Annie watched in amazement as they worked. When they finished, the man with the bear claw necklace spoke to Naya, who then turned to Annie and pointed to the repaired section, making a motion like rain falling and then diverting away. "It won't leak," Annie guessed, and Naya nodded, clearly understanding the gist, if not the exact words. Annie insisted they stay for a meal. She prepared the best food she had, cornbread with honey, the last of her smoked rabbit, and some dried apples. The men were hesitant at first, but relaxed when Naya began eating comfortably. One of them, the younger of the 2, even smiled at Annie when she offered him more cornbread. After they left, Annie found herself thinking about the differences between what she had been told about the native tribes and what she had experienced firsthand. The settlement people spoke of them as savages and heathens, but all she had seen was kindness, skill, and a willingness to help a stranger. As autumn deepened into early winter, Naya's visits became regular. Every 3 or 4 days she would appear at the creek crossing. Sometimes she came alone, sometimes with others from her tribe, An older woman once accompanied her and showed Annie how to weave tighter, warmer baskets from reeds that grew along the creek. A boy who might have been Naya's brother brought a rabbit he had caught and showed Annie a better way to set her snares. With each visit, their ability to communicate improved. They developed a mixture of both languages, gestures, and drawings in the dirt. Annie learned that Naya's people called themselves the people of the Blue Water, named after the river that ran through their main camp about half a day's journey from Annie's cabin. Naya was the daughter of someone important, a leader or healer. Annie couldn't quite understand which. Annie shared her own story too, about the fever that took her parents, about her determination to keep their home, about her loneliness before Naya had appeared in her life. Whether Naya understood all the details was unclear, but she seemed to grasp the emotions behind the halting words and gestures. One crisp day, when the first dusting of snow had fallen, Annie took out her mother's old Bible. She showed Naya the strange marks on the pages and explained as best she could that these symbols stood for words, that they could capture speech and stories and save them for later. Naya was fascinated. She traced the letters with her finger, just as Annie did when practicing her reading. That day marked the beginning of their lessons together. Annie would show Naya the letters she knew, and Naya would teach Annie the meanings of plants and animal signs in the forest. On snowy days, they would sit by the fire in the cabin, Annie sounding out words from the Bible while Naya worked on a new pair of moccasins she was making for Annie, a gift she insisted would keep her feet warmer than the worn leather shoes she currently wore, but not everyone viewed their friendship with approval. One afternoon, Reverend Thomas from the settlement arrived unexpectedly while Naya was visiting. The look on his face when he saw the native girl sitting comfortably at Annie's table was one Annie would not soon forget. "Child," he said, his voice tight, "a word outside, if you please." Annie reluctantly followed him out of the cabin, aware of Naya's concerned eyes following them. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" the Reverend asked once they were out of earshot. "Consorting with one of them?" "She's my friend," Annie said simply. "She helped me fix my roof after the storm." "These savages cannot be trusted," he insisted. "They may seem peaceful now, but they are cunning. They're watching our settlements, learning our ways, waiting for a moment to strike." Annie thought about the gentle lessons, the gifts of food, the laughter, as they stumbled over each other's languages. "Naya isn't like that," she said. "Naya?" The Reverend's eyebrows shot up. "You even use their heathen names? Child, I fear for your immortal soul. These people do not know God's word." "They know kindness," Annie replied, surprising herself with her boldness. "And Pa always said that was God's word in action." The Reverend left unsatisfied, his parting words a warning that the settlement council would be discussing her situation. Annie returned to the cabin to find Naya standing ready to leave, her face solemn. "Friend." "Trouble?" Naya asked in halting English, gesturing toward where the Reverend had gone. Annie sighed and took Naya's hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "No trouble," she lied, not wanting to worry her friend, but trouble was indeed brewing. Over the next week, several people from the settlement came by, all with the same message dressed in different words. Her friendship with that Indian girl was dangerous, foolish, inappropriate. Mrs. Cooper brought extra provisions. "To see you through winter, dear." But her real purpose seemed to be to warn Annie about their kind and how they couldn't be civilized. What none of them understood was that Annie wasn't trying to civilize Naya, nor was Naya trying to turn Annie into one of her people. They were simply two young women learning from each other, filling the empty spaces in each other's lives with companionship and shared knowledge. Annie's hands trembled as she helped Naya into bed. The native girl's skin burned with fever, her eyes bright and unfocused. Outside, the winter morning was still dark, the sky a deep blue-black scattered with fading stars. Annie lit a lamp and placed it beside the bed, the yellow light revealing the sheen of sweat on Naya's forehead despite the cabin's chill. "How long?" Annie asked, making a motion like the sun rising and setting. Naya held up 2 fingers. 2 days with the fever." Annie's stomach tightened with worry. Her mother had always said the first 3 days were the most dangerous with these winter fevers. Whatever happened, she needed to break Naya's fever before tomorrow night. Annie stoked the fire until the cabin grew warm, then dampened a cloth in cool water and placed it on Naya's forehead. The native girl murmured something in her language. her eyes closing with exhaustion. "Rest," Annie said softly. "I'll help you." While Naya slept fitfully, Annie gathered the herbs her mother had taught her to use for fevers: willow bark for the pain and heat, elderberry to fight the sickness, and the last of the dried mint to soothe the stomach and help with breathing. She boiled water and made a strong tea, adding a spoonful of precious honey to make the bitter medicine more palatable. When Naya woke, Annie helped her sit up enough to sip the tea. Most of it dribbled down her chin at first, but eventually, Annie managed to get her to swallow a decent amount. Throughout that long day, Annie repeated the ritual: cool cloth, herb tea, spoonfuls of broth made from a rabbit she'd caught just the day before. Naya drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes speaking clearly in their mixed language, other times muttering words Annie couldn't understand, her hands plucking restlessly at the quilt. As dusk approached, Annie realized with a sinking heart that Naya wasn't getting better. If anything, her fever seemed higher. In the dim light of evening, Annie searched her mother's old wooden medicine box, hoping to find something, anything she might have forgotten. Her fingers touched a small paper packet in the bottom corner of the box. Unfolding it carefully, she found a dark powder that smelled sharply of tree bark. A memory surfaced, her mother grinding this strange bark that a traveling peddler had sold them, saying it came all the way from South America and could cure the shaking sickness. Her mother had used it when Pa had a terrible fever 2 winters before he died, and Annie remembered how quickly it had helped him. Quinine. That's what the peddler had called it. Annie's mother had been skeptical but desperate enough to try it. Now Annie found herself in the same position, skeptical but desperate. She measured a tiny amount into a cup of water, stirring until the bitter-smelling powder dissolved. Lifting Naya's head, she coaxed her to drink it, apologizing for the awful taste. "Medicine," she explained when Naya grimaced. "Help fever." Through the long night, Annie sat beside the bed, refreshing the cool cloth and giving small sips of water whenever Naya stirred. She talked softly to her friend, telling stories about her parents, about the cabin in happier times, about the spring flowers that would come again after winter passed. She didn't know if Naya could hear or understand, but the sound of a human voice seemed to soothe her. "You have to get better," Annie whispered sometime in the darkest part of the night. "You're the only real friend I have." Toward dawn, Annie must have dozed off, her head resting on the edge of the bed. She woke with a start when she felt a touch on her hair. Naya was looking at her, eyes clearer than they had been since she arrived. "Annie," she said, her voice weak but steady. "Water?" Annie scrambled to fetch a cup of water, her heart soaring. Naya's forehead was cooler, not normal but no longer burning hot. The quinine had helped. After Naya drank, Annie gave her another dose of the powder mixed with honey to disguise the taste, then spooned some rabbit broth into her mouth. "Rest more," Annie said, tucking the quilt around her friend. "Fever better but not gone." Naya nodded and closed her eyes. Her breathing soon became deep and even, real healing sleep at last. Annie tidied the cabin, added wood to the fire, and opened the door to check the weather. The sight that greeted her stopped her heart. Fresh tracks in the snow, many tracks circling her cabin. Someone had been watching in the night. From the type of footprints, Annie guessed they weren't from the settlement. These were moccasin prints similar to the ones Naya's people wore. The tribe was looking for their missing daughter. Annie closed the door quietly, not wanting to disturb Naya's rest. Her mind raced. What would happen when they found her here? Would they think Annie had taken her? Would they understand she was only trying to help? Throughout the morning, Annie kept watch through the cabin's small windows while tending to Naya, whose fever continued to lessen. Around midday, Naya was strong enough to sit up and eat a small bowl of corn mush sweetened with dried berries. She told Annie in halting words about leaving her village in the night, about how worried her father must be. "Father, important man," she explained, making gestures that Annie had come to understand meant a leader or chief, many warriors. The implications sent a chill through Annie that had nothing to do with the winter cold. If Naya's father was an important leader with warriors at his command, and his daughter had gone missing while sick with fever. "We need to get you home," Annie said. Though she knew Naya was still too weak to travel far, Naya shook her head. "Not yet. Still weak." She made a gesture toward the sun, then held up her hand with fingers spread. 5 days, Annie understood. Naya thought she needed 5 days to recover. They might not have 5 days. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Mr. Hobson from the settlement came riding up to the cabin, his old horse trudging through the snow. Annie met him outside, not wanting him to see Naya in her bed. "Afternoon, Annie," he said, his breath clouding in the cold air. "Came to check on you after that big snow. Got enough firewood to last?" "Yes, thank you," Annie said, trying to sound normal. "I'm managing fine." Mr. Hobson's eyes narrowed slightly. "You sure everything's all right? You look tired, girl." Before Annie could answer, Mr. Hobson's gaze fixed on something beyond her shoulder. Annie turned to follow his line of sight and saw Naya's woven bag hanging on a peg near the door, its distinctive tribal patterns clearly visible. "You got company, Annie?" he asked, his voice taking on an edge. "Just a friend," Annie said, lifting her chin slightly. Mr. Hobson dismounted, tying his horse to a post. "That one Indian girl again? The one Reverend Thomas mentioned?" He lowered his voice. "There's talk in the settlement, Annie. The tribe upriver is stirred up about something. 2 hunters saw a group of their warriors moving through the forest yesterday, painted for trouble." Annie's throat went dry. "What kind of trouble?" "Don't know," Mr. Hobson admitted. "But with the way things are between our people and theirs, well, it wouldn't take much to start something nobody could stop." He looked at the cabin door. "If you've got one of them in there, you might be putting yourself in a dangerous spot." "She's sick," Annie said simply. "I'm helping her." "Like anyone would," Mr. Hobson sighed, looking suddenly older. "You've got your pa's heart, that's for certain. He never could turn away someone in need either." He glanced toward the tree line nervously. "Just be careful, girl. First sign of trouble, you come to town, you hear?" After he left, Annie returned inside to find Naya standing weakly by the window. She had heard everything. "My people, looking," she said, her face drawn with worry. "Father thinks. White people take me." Annie helped her back to bed. "When you're stronger, I'll take you home myself," she promised. "I'll explain you were sick." Naya shook her head, frustration clear on her face as she struggled to express complex thoughts with her limited English. Finally, she reverted to gestures, acting out warriors surrounding the cabin, then pointing to Annie with a slashing motion across her throat. The meaning was terrifyingly clear. If the warriors found Annie with their chief's daughter, they might kill first and ask questions later. That evening, Annie kept the lamps dimmed and maintained only enough fire to keep the cabin from freezing. Naya's fever had broken completely, but she was still weak, dozing on and off as her body fought to recover. Annie sat by the window watching the forest edge, jumping at every sound: the crack of a snow-laden branch, the call of a night bird, the distant howl of wolves. She must have fallen asleep sometime after midnight, exhausted from 2 nights of nursing Naya. She dreamed of her parents, of her mother's gentle hands checking her forehead for fever, of her father's strong arms carrying her when she was too sick to walk. A sound pulled her from sleep, a soft whistling noise followed by a quiet thud. Annie sat up straight, suddenly wide awake. The cabin was dark, the fire burned down to embers. Pre-dawn light filtered weakly through the windows, giving everything a gray, ghostly appearance. Another whistle thud, this time followed by voices. Men's voices, speaking low in Naya's language. Annie crept to the window and peered out. Her heart nearly stopped.